Well,
you know.
fine is yeah. I should probably be more forthcoming. I'm doing all right. You know, life is proceeding here as normal. No big news on any particular front, but you know, working on it.
I
That's
get you.
where I'm at.
I get you. Well, today is my birthday, so that's my development. I have
Happy
turned
birthday!
40. I am
Whoa.
40 years old. That is scary. Someone when I told that to someone this week, they called me a baby, which I sort of appreciated. It made me feel like not
Sure.
old. That's
Yeah.
good, you know.
You zoom right past it and then never think about it again. Like
Yeah.
that's how that goes.
40 is the new 22 and a half.
Sure. I don't know. People say stuff like that, but there's some truth to it to the extent that you know the way that people used to think about these things is no longer strictly true.
Mm-hmm.
So that's nice. I don't know what you age you'd pin it down to, but 40 is not what it once was.
This is true, and I will say this. Um, I happen to be working on some things in my life with intention, so I actually do feel like I'm, like, oh, this is the person I should have been at, I don't know, 28. So
Oh, that's good.
that's good. I feel
Yeah,
good
if
about it.
only right. There's a degree I think of actually coming to the conclusion. It's like, oh, I wish I could have known some of this stuff back, when when I had more options.
That's right. Now that I've made all the mistakes
Yeah,
and
there you
learned
go.
from them.
Yeah, it'd be nice to sort of bring that wisdom to a blanker canvas,
That's
but
right.
that's fine. We are where we are.
Yes, and we're talking about things today. We
Yeah,
have a
we are.
theme, actually. It's amazing. I
It's
think this is our
true.
first show with a theme.
Yeah. Um, the boys of
The
various
boys.
stripes.
Boys of different kinds.
That's right.
Yeah, so we're talking about uh, the new-ish Netflix feature, The Boys in the Band. We're talking about the Amazon Prime series, The Boys, which just wrapped up season 2. And we're
Mhm.
going to talk about sandwiches. We're going to get to our sandwich reviews.
That's right.
It's Big
Which
Mac's
you're,
Big Mac Day. So boys, Big Macs.
yeah,
I think we've
that's
got it
right.
covered.
Boys, Big Macs.
So why don't we start with The Boys in the Band? Tell us a little bit about this.
So, The Boys in the Band is a new adaptation of Mark Crowley's play from 1968, which, if you're not aware of it, was and is, I guess, a sort of hallmark. Uh, well, not just hallmark's not the right word. Um, Sort of the first major mainstream piece of uh, gay theater in America, and in many ways became archetypal of that genre, if you will, if we want to call it a genre. Um, was really groundbreaking at its time and has bobbed up periodically since then, since its 1968 production, which began off Broadway and then eventually moved to Broadway, where it was a big hit. Um, Recently, a couple of years ago, the 50th anniversary of the play happened, and there was a revival on Broadway,
Mm.
which was notable because it was the first, Broadway production in which the entire cast was openly gay. That was not true of the 1968 production, in which uh, at least three cast members were straight in that one. And anyway, that 2018 production was notable also because it had a lot of fairly high caliber celebrities in it,
Mm-hmm.
um, who all continued on to this film production for Netflix, produced by Ryan Murphy of, well, most recently American Horror Story, but also Glee and Nip Tuck, as part of his big overall deal with Netflix. This was, he's producing, doesn't really have, an overt creative hand in this. The screenplay for this version of the film, which was actually made into a film previously by William Friedkin back in 1970. But this film script was based on Crowley's play and co-written by him along with Ned Martell, directed by Joe Mantello, who was the director of the Broadway production, and starring Jim Parsons from Big Bang Theory, Zachary Quinto, who's Spock in the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films, Matt Bomer, who is in lots of movies and TV, and I always think of as the guy who almost was Superman because he just looks like he ought to be Clark Kent every time I see him in something. Andrew Rannells from Girls and the Book of Mormon musical. And those are sort of the big names. And then a number of esteemed stage actors in the other roles. Charlie Carver, Robin DeJesus, Brian Hutchinson, Michael Benjamin Washington, and Tuck Watkins. So that's your cast for that. And it's about a group of gay men in 1968 who get together for a birthday party. And things unfold in interesting ways. Play was, again, as I mentioned, the first major piece of gay theater in the mainstream in America. Not that there hadn't been plays previously, but they'd all bubbled up underground until this. And play has an interesting legacy. It's revered in some cases, but it also became controversial even within the gay community afterwards because it exposed so much sort of self-loathing and sort of unpleasantness. It's not sort of an activist's dream of what you would hope the first, well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but some people didn't like it like that. What you would hope the first major mainstream exposure of sort of the gay community would be. And it continues to have bite today, even though it was written in 1968. So that's sort of the broad overview of it. And now it's this movie. And I think it's a pretty good movie.
It is. And for me, the thing that most impresses me about it, I think, is that it is the success with which it translates from stage to screen. It does feel like a play for about 90% of the screen time. There are some things that become a little bit more filmic late in the piece, but everything else, I mean, it's like two or three rooms. The whole thing takes place in 2 or 3 rooms. Yeah. It's tightly filmed. It feels like a play. I think because of the Joe Mantello's involvement and the involvement of so many people from the theater principally, it feels like a play. It feels like a great adaptation, which is not always true. You see things that, and for those of you who sort of don't know this out in the world, but when you're dealing with playwriting versus screenwriting, there are some pretty significant differences about what you can and can't do. Economics, location, and all sorts of things. And this is an adaptation that threads the needle pretty well for me.
Yeah, I'm curious what you mean by feels like a play. It sounds like you are using that in a positive way. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I mean it positively. I think if you're used to watching sort of contemporary TV and film, it can be unsettling watching this play because it does take place in one location.
Yeah, with multiple rooms, which they,
right.
shoot well. I actually think that that set that they work on is really nicely laid out for film. They do a really good job with
Mhm.
that. I
And I mean, I would also just add that the the dialogue and the sort of way they treat that, it's sort of pitter patter at first, and then it changes into some other things. But it lands much more like a play than it does theater in terms of how, or play in terms of film or movie, in terms of how you get the information, in terms of that being a major feature of uh, the artistic experience. Like the best way I can describe it is that it lands on us like an Aaron Sorkin um, kind of
Sure.
writing, which and he's a theater guy who happens to
Hmm.
write for TV and film. So it's a different experience. Like you're sitting there 15 minutes and it sort of lands on you that this is we're not jumping around. It's a tight container, set
Yeah,
wise,
they
time
bump
wise,
things
all
out.
of that. Yeah.
They bump some things out a little bit, like that they obviously don't do in the stage play. They do follow these people, or at least we see them before they're at the party a little bit, and also after. And we do get cutaways to the outside world that makes it feel more filmic. The when you say it feels like a play, in some ways, I do think that's true, and I don't know that it's necessarily to the benefit of the thing at the beginning,
Mm.
particularly. I think oftentimes if a piece of theater is being put on film, you have to work to make it feel like it belongs there, and I think they mostly do a good job with this. Your comparisons to Sorkin, I think, is really apt. I think that it has a lot in common with The West Wing and his talkier sort of TV shows. Also, shows like Mad Men, which take place in small rooms and have people talking. And the shooting style, I think, is very similar to that. And it is an impressive set. The way that it's laid out, it has sort of three major arenas in it. Like one is a bedroom, one is a living room area, and then one is a balcony, and it's all sort of really nicely laid out. There's some interesting moments of interplay between those visually, actually, that are really striking and very filmic. There's this moment where the characters or a group of the characters are dancing out on the balcony, and no, that's not what I'm thinking. Well, what am I thinking of? Or yeah, no, dancing. I think like slow dancing at this one point, and the camera pans, and there's this character who's framed by the doorway in the upper on the upper level of the set leading into the bedroom, making that moment an interesting revelation that's very striking and uh, an impressive piece of camera work
Mm.
on that and staging. I'm impressed. My sense of the sort of play versus film or TV thing, I think, was particularly striking at the beginning, and for me, it worked in a way that wasn't entirely pleasant. Like the play kind of has a slow ramp up between two characters, the character played by Matt Bomber and character played by Jim Parsons from The Big Bang Theory. Again, and watching that, it's like, wow, I am really watching a piece of mid-century American theater here. Like really long monologue conversations between the two of them that don't really feel particularly realistic in some ways. It's like very exposition heavy, and sort of betrays a lot of tropes or elements that feel a little like it's just like I'm listening to two people in a play talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning, and it made me worry a little bit about how the thing would go. But once more characters start getting poured into the mix and it really dives into the conflict and everything, the dialogue becomes much more, um, you know, much more swift and less punctuated by long monologues, which when they do come up feel earned. And there's this interesting device in it that's sort of the centerpiece of the play. That's this very unpleasant party game that the men all play with each other, and that really feels like you're watching like a Hitchcock drama, like it has this really nasty thriller sort of feeling to it. There's so much tension and emotional weight in it, and it feels like it has really dangerous stakes to it. I mean, that's the most striking thing to me about this play is that it really has teeth in a way that is very, you know, still shocking and striking today. I can only imagine it must have broken people's brains in 1968. Um, but again, it is interesting because it is so sort of its portrayal of the gay experience. I mean, we should note here that you and I are two straight white men talking about this, so it's like perhaps not the best in terms of being able to uh, say what is and isn't realistic, but it is certainly rooted in a period in which your life was threatened in all sorts of ways, both literal and metaphoric, by being gay. But interestingly, before AIDS had become a thing, which is fascinating because that really became the main focus of so much of gay theater after this, in terms of the big titles that sort of continue today from the late 20th century. So it's striking to see how much dread and and unhappiness was sort of laced into it before you added this debilitating, awful disease that also became a major feature of the culture. I don't know where I was going with that. Anyway.
Well, I like so for me what works about this, and you said something about this being an artifact of sort of late 1960s theater, and that's the way it lands for me. It's a sort of perfect container on older school way of making plays, where you put everybody in the room and you cause eruptions to happen, and which is not to say that that doesn't happen anymore. I mean, but it tends to be that our style in contemporary theater has shifted to more deconstructed stuff. And
Yeah, and this is very sort of, yes, that's right, more overtly theatrical, and or yeah, metaphorical, Brechtian, all that stuff. Like well, not that Brecht is modern, but it's yeah, it's like this is a thing that's happening in front of you as if you were watching a movie or a TV show. And after a while, it really does feel like you're watching a TV show for me. Like that was the way that it slotted in. Like I'm watching an Aaron Sorkin show or Mad Men or one of those sorts of things. The performances are, I think, across the board really quite good. And it's striking. Jim Parsons is the main character in the play, and I'm not a particularly a fan of The Big Bang Theory. Just wasn't for me, and never particularly responded to his character on that. Who was what's his name? I don't even remember. He's like Sheldon. That's right. He's Sheldon, who I believe, and I may be wrong about this, is on the spectrum on that show, and has a very sort of particular way of speaking. And Jim Parsons is in an interesting position as an actor because you get saddled with a role like that that's so specific and particular and that becomes so iconic and successful. It can really kind of ruin your career after that for a while also making you unbelievably rich, which he certainly is, after doing, I think, 12 seasons of that show, being one of the highest performing shows on television now in a rich syndication deal. It's like, Jim Parsons is set for life, but what creative opportunities does he have, as an actor? And this is an interesting role to have taken, just because, it's not a family film, and sort of steps into whatever controversy may be attendant to the fact that he's gay, which is obviously not the same as it was in 1968 for actors in that show. But it's interesting because he has certain mannerisms and ways of speaking and whatnot that are specific to him, and that uh, you know maybe are somewhat in common with Sheldon, that character. But it's interesting to see them recontextualized in this show. And the thing, and you know I think it's a good performance. It's also the most sort of overtly theatrical, I feel like, in some ways, and that's a function, I think, of partly what I was talking about before, where that character has long expositional monologues that really set the play up. But it's interesting to see Parsons doing something with his toolkit as an actor that is as different from the thing that he was made famous for. So
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the DNA is there because the actor is there. But this landed. I many years ago, my wife was into Big Bang Theory quite a bit, so I caught a lot of those episodes. And this is it's different. It just lands as different. I'm totally willing to buy this character, and it goes to different places in part because of the material, right?
right.
Goes to different places that so even though Sheldon and this character maybe have some comic elements in common, the
Yeah.
piece sort of calls him out towards a darker, snarkier, meaner place, and he's able to get there.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, it's the use of sort of his skills and particular tools as an actor applied in such a different context from that show that's really kind of fascinating to watch. And you do buy it. I also think that he's used in a very savvy way, in part because you know Sheldon on that show on Big Bang Theory is supposed to be an annoying character in many ways, but also one that the people love. The audience becomes invested in and cares about, and there's a lot of affection there. And I feel like they really are kind of leveraging that in this show. It's like this is a person who people have warm associations with, and the way that the play begins, I think he's not like Sheldon to the extent that he's like, the character is very perceptive, and there is a degree of self-absorption that I think is common between the two of them, but he's also, clearly a more functional person who is aware of what's going on around him in a way. But he is presented sympathetically at the beginning of this thing, and then just turns really, really mean as the play continues in a way that is clearly they were aware. It's like we're taking sort of America's little teddy bear sitcom guy, and we're going to make him into something really this harrowing monster by the time you get to the middle of that play, and then try to redeem him again at the end, or at least make you feel for him. And I think they're pretty effective at that. But that's just him. There's a lot of other people in the cast too.
Yeah, well, I think that points me to sort of what is this piece about?
Yeah.
And why does it work in 1968, and why does it work in 2018 and now? And for me, the most effective parts are center around sort of pain. I mean, just that's it. A
Mm-hmm.
bit sort of the pain that these characters are in as a function of being gay, and the societal and personal and familial pressures that they're facing as a result of that. And it it still lands it still lands
Yeah,
like
it
that. I mean, that's
does.
part of the sort of the narrative of gay life in American culture is still this.
Yeah, maybe not quite to the same extent, and obviously there are extenuating aspects to it that don't make it
Mm-hmm.
exactly the same. But the fact that it's as compelling as it is in and of itself, an indication that the struggles and the issues that people are dealing with in this place still continue to be vital and present in our society, which is, you know, very sad. Uh, the play does an interesting thing where it really shows different forms of different forms, different kinds of ways to be gay in America, and the way that different. It must be said these are all men. Obviously, like this is a very like gay men thing. This is not about women, but the way that different men have to navigate those things, and also the way that race can play into that as well. It's striking. For instance, there's a character in the play who is not part of the core group of friends, who is an old friend from college of Jim Parsons' character, who is, for all intents and purposes, understood to be straight by all the rest of the characters. Um, and I think he's really a catalytic character in the show. Like his presence in the at the party when he shows up really kicks off everything that follows. And was it must have been interesting in 1968 for audiences watching that, because that character, there's a way to watch this and believe that he's reading as straight for the entire show. And I'm certain that in 1968 particularly, a lot of people watched this and assumed, oh, he's a straight character, and he really performs that function in the show where where he is, for a straight audience, sort of an audience surrogate in some respects, who is encountering different aspects of gay life that he's not familiar with. It's interesting to see certain characters, particularly like, say, the character who's played by Robin DeJesus, um, is a very stereotypical sort of fey um, uh, gay man in this show, the most sort of explicitly, uh, again, stereotypical in that way. Not to say that it's not realistic, but it's striking in a world where we've had Will and Grace, for instance, as not just once but twice as television shows on the air in which you're playing with that very demonstrative, sort of flamboyant presentation of homosexuality. Everybody's really used to that now, but back in the time this came out, spending an extended period of time with that character and really humanizing them must have felt really radical.
Mm-hmm.
And that character in particular really gets under the skin of this sort of straight presenting character. And it does feel a little bit like, while he's being unpacked for that character, that's doing a job for the audience, who I think must have on some level been assumed to be straight for the most part by the people producing the original Broadway production. But what's interesting is that Crowley's intention clearly always was that straight presenting character is actually gay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the subtext of it, which eventually becomes text at a certain point, but then resolves in a way that is somewhat ambiguous, or left to be ambiguous particularly in 1968. What's interesting about this production is that nobody is pretending that it's ambiguous anymore. Like in the way that the characters are talking about it, the actors, it's all these are 9 gay characters played by 9 gay men, and so when you read it like that without having to bring this sort of baggage of is he or isn't he from 1968, which clearly was a hinge point in the drama for some people. Probably not for the original gay audience of the show. I mean, I think the show can be read on multiple levels, but that brings in an interesting dimension to it, particularly for that original audience. But when you're watching it in 2020 and understand that that's who you're looking at, it just becomes a really interesting character sort of piece, and I think that's the real strength of the show. Each of the characters is really specific and authentic, and it plays, in a really effective way. So it's good stuff. I don't know.
You should watch it. If you're out there, you should watch it. It's worth your time.
Yeah,
It really
it
is.
is. Yeah, and again, one of the more effective pieces of theater to film adaptation in recent memory, particularly for a show that's as stagey as it is.
And I was gonna just to go back to the Ryan Murphy involvement here. Uh, Ryan Murphy is not afraid of being theatrical on screen at all, and this seems like for his involvement and for what it's worth, I don't know what that process was like, but it's a really light touch from him. Now, part of that is Joe Mantello is sort of a legend in his own right, particularly on the theater side, and may not even need that involvement from a producer that can be heavy-handed.
Well, distinctive.
Yeah,
like Ryan Murphy has a really distinct style,
mm-hmm.
and this show I think overlaps in certain key respects with his style. Particularly this sort of engagement with melodrama and the big feelings. And it's interesting that Murphy's always had sort of a large queer component in all of his shows that he's done over the years. But if anything, that has been escalated over time. And it's fascinating to see him over in Netflix. Really, every one of his projects. The third one I think that that has come in under his banner. The first being his Hollywood miniseries that sort of reimagines Golden Age Hollywood through a fantasy of what it would have been like if sort of minorities and sort of more oppressed people had come to the fore and taken over in those days and been able to sort of be more openly themselves at that time. And then this, and then the Nurse Ratched show, which is bonkers and worthy of a different discussion, but it plays with sort of ideas of camp that are very connected. Murphy's talked about it, connected to his self-identity as a gay man. So it's interesting that he's really made that his project in many ways, over the course of his career, and finding ways to engage with non-gay audiences while also being fiercely sort of out and interested in creating media representations of gay people. And that's, I think, this show, as much as anything, like I'm not sure he had a huge creative hand in this, except to the extent that it clearly is a formative text for him, and he wanted to get it out there in the sort of best possible presentation that he could. So, I think did a pretty good job of it. It's a good show.
So now we're going to talk about different boys.
Yes, now we will talk about
Almost
different boys.
completely different boys.
Yeah,
If you could
very
imagine
different.
the exact opposite of the boys in the band, you might imagine Amazon Prime's series The Boys. Rob, tell us a bit about that.
So The Boys is a adaptation of Garth Ennis's comic book of the same name. Uh, Garth Ennis, who I think came to fame in America, particularly as a comic artist, with his Vertigo comic series Preacher. And it's worth spending a moment to talk about Ennis before we get into this. Ennis is Irish, or he's American, but he was born in Northern Ireland, and so that actually, in a lot of ways, impacts his work. But it's interesting because, like, his most famous series are both very American. But he brings a sort of outsider's eye to American culture. First, famously did that in Preacher, which was about sort of his impression of American religiosity, combined with a really gonzo religious sort of fantasy and transgressive violence and storytelling. That was sort of the thing that made Preacher such a wallop as a comic. Was like nothing was sacred, and he was willing to do things that were really uh, shocking in that book, both in terms of the violence and also the ideas that he was willing to sort of wade into. Very dark and grim, almost to the point of nihilism. And then, so that was a 9-year run on that comic book, really made him famous, and did some other things. Eventually, he did The Boys, which was with Dynamite Comics, and it's a comic book that really was deconstructive of superheroes, in along a similar line to what Alan Moore did with Watchmen, a good 15 years earlier than The Boys. What was, you know, Alan Moore, in this sort of sophisticated way, was indicating, superheroes are not necessarily people who we should have as heroes, and if you have that kind of power in real life, it would be questionable. And that's a fascinating text. Created a really interesting show, sequel, which we've talked about here a little bit recently. What and what's interesting is that it really incorporates, like, when this is a long wind up, but I will get to a landing place. When Alan Moore did Watchmen, what was interesting is that kind of deconstructive element really got folded into mainstream comics, where it became really normal for major superhero comics to have some moral ambiguity to them, and for those comic characters to be, uh, questionable, and for those things to be posed, those sorts of moral dilemmas, the sorts of moral dilemmas that accompany, what it would be to be like a all-powerful being trying to do the right thing, and is that possible? That just became really normal. What was interesting about what Ennis did with The Boys is it was no longer this question of, can you do good? Is it possible to do good? And he just answered really bluntly, no, this kind of power will absolutely make people into monsters. And the degree to which the characters in that comic book, the superhero characters, are the villains of the show, or of the book, and of the show. And as transgressive as Preacher was, The Boys is even more transgressive in terms of its violence, in terms of the ideas that it's willing to show, and play with, and is really, really absolute in its statement that superheroes are bad. They are bad, and if they existed in the world, they would be the scariest people ever to exist. And the nihilism in that comic book series is so profound and so upsetting in many ways. Uh, and now it's a TV series produced by Seth Rogen and his partner. Um, and it continues to sort of carry a real wallop, although it's a step back from what they had in the books. We could maybe talk about that a little bit. Anyway, it's in its second season now. It's about superheroes who are villains and a group of sort of mostly normal people who are a kind of CIA team, essentially, who are tasked with keeping an eye on the excesses of superheroic activities which the public believes to be unambiguously good, while those in power in the government understand that they're actually really, this complicated thing of in many cases really evil, but a useful tool that is being used by a sort of public-private thing. Like the superheroes are all owned or come out of this company called Vought, which is who they all work for and who coordinates them. And there's sort of this uneasy, partnership between the public sphere, the politicians and police, and this private company that has these people involved in law enforcement, and they're very powerful and very amoral. Anyway, show's in its second season now, and I think it's real good.
Yeah, I think it's really good too. So when I started this show, Watchmen was right there. I mean, they were within weeks of each other last year, and the boys really had to sort of stand up to that. It's not as familiar in the culture as the Watchmen for sure, so there was a kind of hurdle there. And it's a show that doesn't get made if the Avengers and all of that hasn't been happening in movie theaters over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, that's just to interject. That's really true. People have tried to make this show over the last few years, and couldn't get it done in part because I think the audience wasn't ready for it. Anyway, keep going.
Well, it's specifically about the deconstruction here. They're really trying to take apart, I think, calling back to the Avengers. And that happens most apparently. Now, I haven't read the comics, so you can tell me more about this. But it happens most apparently with this figure of Homelander, who is the sort of emblem of Captain America.
And so it's like Captain America with Superman's powers, basically.
Captain America with Superman's powers, and he is, from the start of the series, the most expressly evil of this conglomerate of evil villains, or evil superheroes, where their public persona is positive, it is marketed, it's presenting as the Avenger kind of prototypes to the public, but behind the scenes, evil is being done, crashing planes and sexual assaults and all kinds of weird other stuff, extreme violence, and so this is, I think, intentionally focused on subverting that, and it's doing it through the Captain America figure, who's called Homelander, and lands in this show like a fascist, like a xenophobe, and who is has the opposite of sort of homespun American values.
Yeah, although pretending to actually, embody them. And I think that also part of Ennis's project is to suggest that, in fact, maybe homespun American values are not as, are not as incongruent or incompatible with fascism and whatnot as Americans would like to believe. I think that one of the messages that he has is that, in fact, that sort of expression of Americanness that people think of positively is in fact in its underpinnings really uh, pretty terrible. And the thing about I will say the show is much more subtle than which sounds crazy. If you've only seen the show, to suggest that it's subtle in any ways is maybe surprising. But the comic book is so extreme in its presentation of the villainy of the superheroes, and to the point where it becomes sort of didactic in some respects, and is like never boring, in part because it's just so like crazy the things that are happening. But it's a much much bleaker thing than they've done than what they're doing in the TV series, which is really dialed back a few points, I think, necessarily in order for people to be able to get on board with it at all. For instance, you talk about sexual assault, which becomes a major storyline in the first season of the show, with this one character in particular who behaves in a way that has some resonance with like the Me Too movement and whatnot, and all of that. And the way that they deal with that on the show is vastly different from the way that it happens in the comic book. For instance, they center all of that into one character in the TV show, when in fact in the comic book it's something that's participated in by all of the male superheroes in the core group called the Seven, which is this sort of variation on the Avengers or the Justice League. And the sort of, again, unambiguous evil of these characters from the very beginning is just right there. The inciting incident of the book, there is this character who's just this normal kid. I mean, he's like, I don't know, late 20s, who has a boring sort of life as a sales clerk, but has a girlfriend who he loves, and that girlfriend gets grotesquely killed as collateral damage in a superhero fight by this superhero who isn't even aware that he did it, or you think maybe he isn't aware, but we come to find out that he is later aware that he did it. Anyway, in the book, like that character's killing of that superhero, who's sort of a variation on the Flash, who can run very fast and basically collides with this woman and explodes her. He is frankly not a very interesting character in the book. He's just sort of self-absorbed and evil, and there's nothing else there. What the TV show does is like adds layers of texture and really delves into this character emotionally in a way that you'd have to if you're going to make a TV series. And there's an interesting sleight of hand happening here in this show that they do well. That happens with a lot of TV now, where you take characters who are really evil in a lot of respects, if you're just looking at the sort of broad overview of them, and then makes you care about them and humanizes them using what are frankly a lot of sort of interesting TV writer tricks, but that if you stand back, you'd be like, wait, no, I don't need to identify with this horrible character, but that's the game of the show, and they do a good job with it. I thought the first season was pretty good, but the second season is actually, I think, much better than the first one.
Yeah, it's an upgrade for me for sure. I'm like 2/3 of the way through it, 3/4 of the way through the second season. You can tell that they got a budget. That's number one. I mean, the production values in season 2 are manifold improvements over the first season, which feels like a kind of moderate budget attempt to tell this story, and they really ramp up in season 2.
Yeah, I think something that's a difference is like the first season is very aggressive with pushing a lot of the more transgressive elements of the show into your face. in a way that's very much in keeping with the comic. But in the second season, they give the characters and their stories a little bit more room to breathe and aren't quite as worried about like putting down their calling card. Other shows do this too. Game of Thrones did it as well, where the first season was like, wait till you see what we're going to do. A lot of moments like that, where they were sort of really aggressively, transgressive or sexual in ways that were like, look at what we're doing. And it's not like those elements ever went away in the show, but they didn't feel. I mean, there's a sense of emphasis in the beginning that's like, look what we're doing, look what we're doing. And it's like, okay, you understand what this is and that these are elements of this series. And now we don't feel quite as much of a need to uh, really aggressively push them because they're there and they come up, and the sort of transgressiveness of this story continues to be a thing. But it's also more rooted in the drama of the characters, I feel like now, which is very interesting. One interesting aspect of the show, which I think is kind of a not a it hurts the first season a little bit, and the second season deals with this problem really effectively, is that The Boys is as a comic is really, really rooted in the George W. Bush administration, like really heavily. And that was Ennis's given reason for doing the show. Um, it's like his disgust with what he saw as the hypocrisy of America in the Bush administration, where they're pretending to be liberators and everything while at the same time secretly torturing people. And it's an expression of that disgust. And it really is a Bush era artifact in many respects. Like that particular, you know, um, that particular grievance is laced in throughout the thing in a way that feels very much of that time. Also, interestingly, its read on religiosity in America is very much a Bush era religious sort of thing. The particularly with regard to sort of born again um, Christianity, which actually plays a large part in the arc of this one character who came out of a sort of religious background and then slowly becomes disenchanted with it because it's been laced in with. Actually, the superhero heroicism and the company that sort of is behind that, it makes for a really pretty good metaphor for America. But it's a little off. It's just in the Trump era, particularly, it's like there's not an accurate portrayal of the way that we think. I mean, it's not to say that those forces don't exist, but they're not dominant in the culture in the same way. And also, the advent of Donald Trump has really complicated that in ways that I think the first season kind of struggles with a little bit to feel entirely contemporary. Um, what's striking about the second season is that they really found some specific targets and things to look at that feel extremely vital. There's a character who named Stormfront in the in this second season, who is this woman superhero who is very much an expression of sort of internet meme culture
Mm-hmm.
and sort of particularly of the kind of alt-right variety at the beginning, and really that ethos. And the show, through her, has a lot of very smart things to say about about the way that sort of racism works in our culture right now, and the way that it is knowingly employed with irony and in order to obfuscate what it actually is. And that's really the game they're playing with this character, where it turns out that she's pretending to, be mainstream while under the umbrella of sort of irony and whatnot, introducing these really virulent and intentional, ideas, and the revelations about her character as the show goes on become.
Yeah, it's amazing. One
really
of the things
interesting.
I like about this show, on a character and plot level, and certainly on the level of violence and content, is that it's surprising,
Yeah,
which is not true. I mean, the last show that surprised me, I think surprised everyone, was Game of Thrones, and that's sort of how it became. That's how it got on the map in part. And this does that for me. It is actually shocking.
yeah,
It's the So the thing about it, you keep saying it's dialed back from the comics, but
it
I
is.
will say this: I'm perfectly comfortable with screen violence and uh, and screen sexuality for that matter. But this is not a show I could watch with basically anyone else I know.
Yeah,
It would be awkward if they were in the room, and uh, I'm like my wife has been in the room a few times while I've watched this. She's got her headphones in, listening to podcasts or whatever, and there are noises that come from the screen. Like, oh my god, what just happened?
right.
So it is transgressive. It does on a content level. That's not just about violence and not just about sexuality. It's not just visual. Is appalling. It's just
Right.
nonstop appalling, and I it does a good job of never desensitizing you to that, which I think is good. And it's not a show you can't watch it with your kids. You can't watch it with your parents. If you're watching it with best friends, be prepared for it to be awkward. Specifically when they get to the sex stuff, because it's as
And
extreme
it
as you can
always,
make on
yeah,
Netflix. I
the
think.
sexuality when it's portrayed in the show is always transgressive sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's never there's nothing like a normal sex scene. Well, I guess there is maybe once or twice something like a normal sex scene in the course of this, but almost always the point of it is to be shocking and transgressive in some way. And same with the violence. I mean, it's laced into the intention of the thing. And the book is like a much more concentrated dose of all of that, and so they pick their moments and their aspects of it to really lace into the TV show. Frankly, the book's too much for me. Like I just couldn't engage with it because it was so profoundly nihilistic and dark to a point. It's like I just don't find this enjoyable, and they really done a good job with this show. And they have really smart things to say about society, about business, and the intersection of business
Mm-hmm.
and government, particularly in this second season. And it has a sharp, satiric eye. I have to say, working as I mentioned on here on a RoboCop project in the past, and been in discussion about this with our creative team on the project, like this captures the sort of mix of bleak satire and also action and drama that's involving, but with that sort of dark, satiric, humorous eye of RoboCop, better than anything since RoboCop and Starship Troopers, better than anything else in memory. Honestly,
Mm-hmm.
it's and we, that's something that we've noticed on here. It's like that's the exact tone of the thing, um, in a way that is pretty striking and has some very interesting things to say about business, particularly in the last few episodes. Also, it's worth saying, like, there's a funny Scientology, um,
Yeah.
storyline in here that also resolves in a very funny way. A lot of it revolving around like cans of Fresca. That is super funny, which becomes this isn't
And it
exactly
has
as
become a sort of meme or
yeah.
in itself.
Yeah, the Fresca thing is funny because there was some discussion I had the other day with a couple of folks about this. And it's like, what does the Fresca mean? And what the last few episodes I feel like really make clear is that the Fresca is like this little metaphor for Scientology or that whole or that kind of cult like religious sort of organization, which is essentially it's like this thing that nobody actually likes and that people find off-putting, or don't no one really likes Fresca, but if somebody is in a really friendly way offering one to you and you take it because you don't want to be rude, then it means you're open to taking whatever they might offer you, until you get to the point where you're offering cans of Fresca to other people. And there's a moment in, I think, the last episode that really highlights that, where there's a character, when he's offered a can of Fresca, has a very specific reaction to it that is different from everybody else's, and it's like, oh, that's the game. That's really interesting. So
yeah, just a couple more notes from me. We're talking about the second season upgrades. They get an upgrade in the cast pretty much across the board, including Giancarlo Esposito as a major figure.
He showed up like in the last episode of the first season, but he becomes much more of a focus in the second season.
Yeah, they introduce characters, and it's just an upgrade to the cast overall. I personally find the cast mixed, from it's a B or C level cast in Act 1, or in Season 1, with a couple of standouts, including the actor who plays Homelander.
He's
and Carl Urban. Who's the other lead.
We haven't talked about him at all, but he's like the main character of the show. Who's this British Cockney bruiser who's the head of the boys who are against the superheroes.
Yeah, and it's I just feel like across the board in the second season, there's a feeling of upgrade in terms of the new characters. They're and the kind and quality of actor that they're doing.
Yeah, I also think it's a function of the writing improving a lot in the second season, that the actors have more interesting things to do too. So even the cast that remains, they're suddenly doing more interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, I think it's worth your time.
It is, but with a heavy warning disclaimer at the beginning. This is not a show that's for everybody. Though honestly, it is a massive hit. It is a massive hit. This second season has blown up numbers for Amazon, and is by far the most popular show that they have put on as a network. It is running away with things. This is like a show that in its second season really crystallized its audience, and really people got super engaged with, and has been happily renewed for at least one more season, maybe two, and they're also developing a spin-off now. So I mean, this is a big fat hit, and next year when it comes back, it's going to be an even bigger deal.
All I want to say is, don't watch it while you're eating spaghetti. It's not a good move. Just don't do it.
Or maybe that's your thing. This is a show about people who have weird have weird things.
That's right. All right, we're moving on. It's sandwich review time. For those of you who follow us, you'll know that at the end of every episode recently, we have reviewed sandwiches, mass market sandwiches. We give them a little score. They're in competition with each other. We've done several. We're going to do several more. Today's sandwich, in keeping with our theme, our alliteration, is the Big Mac. So boys, Big Mac.
Mm-hmm.
And it's time. Now, I want to say, we've said this before, but Rob and I wrote these reviews sometimes several years ago, and things have changed, and McDonald's is one of those ways that have changed, so I'll sort of annotate that as I go through my review. But I'll give you my scores, and then I'll speak to the Big Mac. So I have flavor 2, mouthfeel 1 point, adjoining produce 0, bread 0, meat 2 points, adjoining sauces and condiments 0, sandwich aesthetic 1, complementary items 0, contextual sleaze -1, appraisal of the cost 0, personalities nigh unto the sandwich 1, nature of the sandwiches lingering in the memory -1, for a total of 5 points out of, what is it, 25? Is that mean?
No, out of 50.
Out of 50. That's not good. The Big Mac, for all its pop culture impact, is not among the top 3 sandwiches at McDonald's. For the records, those are the McDouble, the Quarter Pounder with cheese, and the recently deceased Steak Bagel Breakfast Sandwich, each of which is a simpler sandwich with much more flavor than the overhyped sauce fest that is the Big Mac. I'm not sure McDonald's knows what to do with the Big Mac, like its premium burgers and chicken sandwiches. The Big Mac finds its way into a box instead of a whatever that is, wrapper.
Mm-hmm.
My sample was leaned over to the side, a sludge of 3 buns, excessive amounts of chopped lettuce, and far too much special sauce. The eating experience was terrible, mostly a spongy mouthful of too much bread and sauce flavor, with the burger itself being a nearly unnecessary coincidence. Much has been made of McDonald's decline in recent years, hampered by becoming one of the emblems of valid public health, economic, and ecological concerns. McDonald's has become the Walmart of fast food, beleaguered by cheap core products that come at a significant cost to health, societal well-being, and animal welfare, all the while sustaining significant losses in its market by the growth of places like Five Guys, Chipotle, and other middle-speed restaurants with higher quality products, in a sense that you aren't maybe consigning the employees to a lifetime of poverty. I want McDonald's to rebound in an honest way. The Big Mac would be a good place to start.
All right. And here is my ranking and then review. Flavor, 4. Mouthfeel, 2. Adjoining produce, 0. Bread, 1. Meat, 2. Adjoining sauces and condiments, 1. Sandwich aesthetic, 2.5. Complementary items, 2. Contextual sleaze, -1. Appraisal of the cost, 2. Personalities nigh unto the sandwich, 2. And the nature of the sandwiches lingering in the memory, -1, for a total of 16.5 out of 50 points. Listen, I wanted to like it. As much as we acknowledge the Earl of Sandwich as a father of this project, the whole thing probably wouldn't be happening if not for McDonald's. The Golden Arches are a font from which all American mass-produced sandwich chains flow, and the Big Mac is easily the most iconic competitor in the field. I have approached these rankings with the thus far unarticulated hope that we would upend our expectations and find value in those sandwiches that we take for granted are going to be bad. Nothing would make me happier than to report that my experience eating a Big Mac was a satisfying one, in which I found surprising hidden qualities that explain why this burger has endured for so many years. But ugh. And at the same time, of course, McDonald's hasn't experienced more than 12 straight months of declining sales for nothing. Now, again, as Jeremy mentioned, this is not necessarily the case now, but we'll get into that in our discussion about this. First, though, before I get to burying Caesar, let me acknowledge that the service was fine. My drive-thru experience was quick, efficient, and friendly. This is what McDonald's built its brand on. As I ordered, it occurred to me that I had never actually eaten a Big Mac before. I'm not sure what exactly I expected. I guess I assumed the patties would be meatier or something, like a quarter pounder. I think part of the issue is that the picture in the commercials, in those commercials, the burger always looks so, well, big. So when I opened up the handsome box, points there for presentation, I was sorely disappointed by the realization that the sandwich was just 2 McDonald's cheeseburgers stacked on top of each other with a buttload of lettuce and special sauce, which I'm pretty sure is just ketchup and mayonnaise mixed together, so not so special. The patties were thin and unremarkable, the bread like the foam from a couch cushion. The sandwich was not particularly warm either, due to the thinness of the patties. Its admittedly visually distinctive multi-tiered construction and the insubstantial buns. I'm not sure the Big Mac is constitutionally capable of retaining heat for more than a couple of minutes. The shredded lettuce is an affront to the American farmer, stringy and unattractive, like edible Easter basket grass that sweats. Seriously, who likes that crap on their sandwiches? I got fries and a Sprite with my Big Mac, and they actually improved the experience somewhat. I know that McDonald's fries are the devil. I saw Supersize Me, but whatever. A natural process they put those potatoes through. They sure do taste good. Similarly, I know that McDonald's does something unique to their fountain drinks that makes them taste better than everybody else's, and this is actually true. They store them in stainless steel tanks and super cool them so that when they hit your drink, they are just about to freeze. And sodas, when served very cold, are better than any other way of drinking them. So again, good stuff there, McDonald's. So, good around the edges, but lacking in terms of the main event. And that really sums up the weird position McDonald's is in right now. They refined and dominated the fast food burger joint until they practically became synonymous with it worldwide. And they came up with innovations that put them at the top of the heap when you're looking for a cheap, okay sandwich quickly. They can do service and side dishes better than anyone, but their legacy menu is ill-equipped to deal with the world in which fast food places are becoming more culinarily ambitious. So that's where we leave things. The story of McDonald's has actually continued somewhat in interesting ways since we wrote these original reviews, though. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, so the two or three things here. McDonald's did wake up to the fact that they had to compete with sort of the casual dining, slower fast food like the Chipotle. And for a while, they still are, but there was a real push, 3 or 4 years ago, to create competition to those. And they did it in a couple ways. So there were menu upgrades, first of all, and then second of all, there were facility upgrades. And so every McDonald's you walk into is probably been renovated in the last 4 or 5 years. They are sleeker, they are more modern, they feel more contemporary. They are not the sort of dumps that you have in your head when you think about, say, Hardee's. It's clean, it's sleek, it's better.
Yeah, they should have took a note from Starbucks in some ways.
Yeah, and they've adopted the technology of Starbucks and other places too, where you can order online and you could do a touch screen and all of that. And they've adopted premium beverages to compete in part with Starbucks, the sort of less expensive alternative to coffee products. So they've done a lot there. I think they figured out that they could not actually compete with the Chipotles of the world, and actually don't want to. Part of what you point to in your review is that McDonald's is responded to in part because of its speed. You can get through that driveway quickly, and that is part of what you're buying when you buy a just okay sandwich or just okay fries. It is about speed. And they have mastered it, and that's what they are continually working towards. So there was a chapter 3 or 4 years ago when they were clearly in debate about how they wanted to handle their sort of hallmark speed versus the quality competition that came up. And what they've actually settled back into is speed. And they did it in a couple of ways where they simplified their menu. This was before COVID. They simplified their menu significantly and did things like offer breakfast all day.
Yeah, that's a key thing. Like that was very smart.
Yeah, so they've done that. And then since COVID, they've simplified even more. So we've lost some of the ends of the menu niche products like the steak bagel burger that I love, or steak bagel sandwich that I love. And a couple of other things like that are no more, but they've done it in the name of speed. And I just want to add one other thing, which is I would never have predicted this, but one of the things about McDonald's is also an emblem of wherever you are. So it's a big national company, international company, but your experience of McDonald's is also driven by the economics of the market that you're in. So I grew up in the Midwest. Then I went to grad school with you in a fairly affluent, mid-sized town. And the McDonald's that I'd experienced it was like maybe a minute, 15-second proposition from beginning to end. And when I got to Fayetteville, the number one thing I noticed, first of all, was that it was much slower. like cars wrapped around the building slower. And I think personally that's a reflection of the economics of the region here, uh, like down education, um, lower aptitude as a result, employees, and I would never have predicted it. But now I have a sense about that. I would add just the other part of the story here over the last 4 or 5 years has been Bernie Sanders, really, and his using of McDonald's as the emblem of underpaid employment alongside Walmart. But I think McDonald's actually carries the banner here. And the push by him towards $15 an hour and all of that thing. And I think it's been that alongside Supersize Me and some other things have caused McDonald's to have to become the leader that it wasn't in all of these areas like environment and labor and all the other stuff that has been in the culture in the last handful of
Yeah,
years.
it's interesting. I mean, we both talked about sort of decline of McDonald's in our piece, but what we didn't get at in that is that even then, it's still the industry leader and is now too. And part of the reason that they continue to do that is that they're smart about the innovations that they make, and they know, they're a dynamic company in their ability to sort of respond to things. But and one of the issues, like you say, is they have worked to take sort of human error out of the process as much as they possibly can. And clearly, like though, as you say, with the drive-through experience and whatnot, some of that's hard to get around. But so much of that is mechanized there, and the less complicated they can make things for themselves, the better it is. What else is interesting is they had played around with it when we did this original review, but it's since become a major feature on the menu. They do have a tier of premium sandwiches now there, which since COVID isn't always at every restaurant, but that were intended to sort of be a step up from the Big Mac. The Big Mac's a weird sandwich in that it really kind of was the hallmark sandwich for the company, and yet now they've created this tier of sandwiches that they've acknowledged is of a higher quality in some key respect. It's such a strange, the Big Mac is so visually distinctive and stuff. I really didn't like it, and what's striking about that is I'm actually pretty fond of the McDonald's cheeseburger, which this is really just a variation on in some respects. But with the inclusion of the lettuce and that extra bun and so much sauce on there, it's just like this is not something I enjoy.
Yeah,
Like,
it's a perfect for me. It lands as every package you ever get, which is a lot of packing material and very very little content.
right,
Yeah.
right. So that's not great. But as a company, McDonald's is interesting. They've just introduced nationwide a big new menu item for the first time in a while, and that's their spicy chicken nuggets.
They are delicious.
They are delicious.
They are
That's the
really,
thing.
really good.
Yeah, it's like the stuff that McDonald's does. I mean, not to minimize it either. It's like we're talking about sort of middling sandwiches or whatnot, but the things that McDonald's does well, they taste really good. And it's, their fries, for instance, the fact that they do the thing that they do with their drinks
Mm-hmm.
so that they come out colder and sharper than anybody else's soda. That's not a small thing, and that really shows a degree of ingenuity and thoughtfulness other that's clearly lacking in other companies. And it's it's the sort of ability to reproduce the thing as much as possible that makes them what they are. So it's an impressive operation if undergirded by some potentially by some fairly unpleasant things. But McDonald's is an interesting company, and worth we're it is not for nothing that they're at the top of this particular heap. they work hard to stay there. So anyway, Big Mac. So boo for the Big Mac from both of us. This is not a good sandwich. But McDonald's as an organization is an interesting thing to think about. So anyway, we can leave that there, I guess.
All right, we did it. Until
We did
next
it.
time.
Yes. Absolutely.
Ta-ta for now.
All right. Bye-bye, folks.